Well, we've had 3 encouraging weeks looking at King Hezekiah with Pastor Darren. We've been inspired and encouraged and lifted up by all those great things that he did. And now we get to look at King Manasseh. I guess he gets to preach in the bad guy. We do learn a lot from mistakes, though. And our own mistakes, those of other people. I remember one mistake very clearly of my own that I definitely learned from. I was about 8 years old, and my younger brother was 5. The younger brother, my other younger brother was about 3, but the middle brother and I were in our yard at Cloverdale. We had this awesome tree house. Had a slide, trapdoor, had a sandbox, even had a zip line. There was also this rope that hung beside it, had these big chunky knots on it that you used to climb up and down. And one particular afternoon, we found ourselves kind of fighting over this rope. He was on top, and I was on the ground. And you can imagine what happened. We were yanking, and finally I yanked him off. He fell 10 or 12 feet to the ground. And I'm ashamed to say my immediate reaction was not to call for help, to see if he was okay, run to his aid, but it was to come up and say, shh, quiet, you are okay, everything's fine. I was more concerned about my own fate than his. And as it turned out, it wasn't fine, he broke his arm. Sure enough, I got in a lot of trouble. And there's some important lessons you can learn from that kind of thing. One of them for me was, if you're going to pound your brother, always wait until your dad's not home. But I did learn from that. And as my 2 brothers and I continued to pound each other over the years, we relearned our lesson repeatedly. And I'm very thankful today that they are both bigger and taller and stronger than me, but very merciful, and they haven't paid me back for my wrongs against them. Now, we can learn a lot from mistakes, and Manasseh was a man of many. So, as we look at his life, he was one of the worst kings in Judah's history. He wasn't just a decent guy who had some big mess-ups. He was a purveyor of sin. He collected and spread sinful practices. He completely undid all the good that his father Hezekiah had done and replaced the worship of Yahweh, the true God, with as many evil pagan practices as he could find in the nations around him. Just as we learn a lot from what Hezekiah did right, we can learn volumes from what his son did wrong. Turn with me, if you have your Bible, to 2 Kings 21. We'll take a look. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. And he reigned in Judah and Jerusalem for 55 years. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which Yahweh had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In the 2 courts of the temple of Yahweh, he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did as much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. He took the carved Asherah pole he had made and put it in the temple, of which Yahweh had said to David and his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. I will not again make the feet of Israelites wander from the land I gave their ancestors, if only they will be careful to do everything I commanded them, and keep the whole law that my servant Moses gave them." But the people did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. What a resume. This summary of Manasseh's accomplishments stands in direct contrast to the accomplishments of his father. The writer is clearly pointing out a dichotomy between the 2 kings. Everything that Hezekiah got rid of, Manasseh brought back. For reasons that are unclear, the torch was just not passed to the son. The principles of leadership and righteousness that Hezekiah embodied just didn't make it to the next generation. Now you may be thinking, well, Manasseh was 12. really? I mean, no wonder he got so far off track. And I thought that myself. But if you look 2 generations later, his grandson, Josiah, came to the throne at 8. So even if his age was a factor in his miserable track record, it's not entirely to blame. Beyond doing all his father's good work, this list also shows us he was a man completely addicted to sin and control. He actively collected deities and worshipped rituals from the nations around him, and from the northern kingdom of Israel, which was also deeply off track. He rebuilt the high places his father tore down. These were places where people did worship Yahweh, but not in the way they were intended to. Not in the temple, and certainly not exclusively. He reinstituted fertility worship. We talked about that a few weeks ago. He built the altars to Baal and the Asherah poles. In this worship, people believed that by performing sexual acts with the temple priests and priestesses, they would manipulate the gods of the land to somehow give them fertile soil, fertile crops. The goal was to gain control over economic prosperity, agricultural prosperity. Next is the celestial worship, or astral worship. In this worship, he worshipped the stars, the hosts of heaven. The goal was to receive omens and signs about the future, all in a desire to control events and to control his own fortune. He used fortune tellers, consulted mediums, necromancers, all kinds of spiritists to give him an edge on his own fortune, and again, more control over his life. And as if that weren't enough, he even burned his own son. As a new dad, this seems unimaginable. It breaks my heart to think about it. It speaks of the incredible level of sin to which he had sunk, blinded by selfishness and addicted to power, control, and a desire to prove to his collection of pagan deities how serious he was about getting what he wanted. All of this amounts to a man who was completely and utterly consumed by evil. By human standards, it does not look like there's any hope of redemption for this man. Now, the extent of Manasseh's evil is astonishing, but his sin didn't affect just him. Verse 16 says, "Moreover, Manasseh also shed much innocent blood, that he filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He drew them down. He led his nation to even more evil than the nations God had used them to eliminate in the past. He led Judah so astray that God promised judgment on them on account of his sin." You've probably heard of tyrant dictators like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, or Saddam Hussein. All men responsible for leading people into twisted ideologies and ultimately killing millions through war, starvation, genocide, all in the process. Manasseh could easily be counted among them. The severity and longevity of his reign were unprecedented. Though, despite all the things he did, I think the hardest part to grapple with is that he reigned for 55 years. Now, this is actually the longest reign of any king, good or evil, in both Israel and Judah, the southern and northern kingdoms. It's ironic, the worst king with the longest reign. Why? Why does God allow evil to thrive? We've all had to grapple with this question at various times. Why does cancer seem to affect virtually every family? Why do people get away with terrible crimes? Why do tyrants come to power seemingly so often? Last Sunday, if you followed the news, 21 Christian families in Egypt were faced with the reality that their husbands and fathers would never be coming home. I can't imagine their hardship. No doubt many of them are left asking, why? Now, we know God cares about evil. Throughout the Old Testament, God is constantly confronting evil with his holy standard. We know he's entirely good and entirely just. So why does he tolerate such blatant and destructive sin? The question is agonizing. The question has troubled many over the ages and has even blocked some from accepting that God could exist in a world so unjust. I certainly don't have a final answer, but this chapter reveals a lot about evil and why God allows it. First of all, we need to clarify something. It's a fundamentally flawed view to think that we can draw a line between good and evil. We can have the good people, the good ones on this side, the evil people, the bad guys on that side. No. In fact, the line between good and evil is one that runs down the center of each one of us. It's a line that's on each of our hearts as a result of the curse of sin. So we know that evil is not just a cosmic dilemma. It's not a philosophical question. It's a deeply personal problem. As Christians, our view of evil and our response to it needs to be shaped by the character of God. We're going to look at 3 of those characteristics now. God is just, God is merciful, God is sovereign. God is just. He's always been addressing evil. The entire canon of the Old Testament, writes N.T. Wright, tells a story which, from a bewildering variety of angles, is all about what the Creator God is doing about evil. From the moment that Adam and Eve disobeyed, we see God demonstrating his justice. Time and time again, the Bible teaches that God does not tolerate evil. He does not tolerate idolatry. He does uphold the innocent, and he does condemn the evildoer. God's primary means of justice, of showing his justice in the Old Testament, was through the people of Israel. And his primary means of showing salvation was through the people of Israel. He used them to wipe out nations that were practicing absolutely horrific things. What about here? What about when the answer becomes part of the problem? The solution becomes part of the cause. Under Manasseh's reign, we see God's justice burn against his own people. In verse 11 in 2 Kings 21 we read, Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these detestable sins. He has done more evil than the Amorites who preceded him, and has led Judah into sin with his idols. Therefore, this is what Yahweh, the God of Israel, says. I am going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. The justice of God is our hope when confronted with evil. Though we need to remember that our view of justice isn't necessarily God's view of justice. Often what we call just, in reality, is more what's most fair for me, what's most fair for my own best interests. We need to trust that God's idea of justice is much greater and grander than our own. Israel was a flawed judge when it came to delivering justice, but ultimately it will be Jesus who judges us. Revelation 20 says, he will judge us all based on our works. And our amazing hope and comfort is that while God is just, he's also good. This brings me to my second point. God is merciful. Now there's this misconception assumed in Christian circles that the Old Testament, that was the age of law. The New Testament, and today still, that's the age of grace. I think it comes down to a flawed understanding of both law and grace. We either think that, now, Yahweh in the Old Testament was too harsh, he was too brutal, there's too much violence, or the New Testament, the standard of Jesus is just too high. We can't actually live up. It's not realistic, Now, friends, that's not the case. There is a righteous standard God has set in the person of Jesus, and there's also endless grace for us as we seek to follow him. Lamentations 3:22-23 says, time and time again we see God extending mercy and patience to a wayward people. Lamentations says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. It's not that there's an age of law and an age of grace today. It was always grace. It's an age of grace and an age of grace. We constantly see God extending his mercy and patience to a wayward people. The children he calls his own, but who wander off his path so frequently, like sheep, swayed by every other ideology or attractive fad or latest whatever. Sounds familiar. God is calling us back to himself all the time, and he knows the sin we've committed in the past. He knows the sin we'll commit in the future. He knows the sin we're currently wrestling with. Yet he still loves us. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. This phrase we find throughout the Old Testament. This was a motto that Israel used in their worship, in their prayers. I don't think we can even grasp the love of God and God's love for humanity. After all, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not die, but have eternal life. So beautiful. Friends, it comes down to that. It comes down to Jesus, his death and resurrection. The only solid ground we have to land on as we wrestle with suffering and evil is the foot of the cross. Israel was meant to be God's light of salvation to the nations. They were meant to keep themselves pure and uncorrupted from the nations around them. And on both accounts, they frequently failed. The kings, starting with Saul, through David, through Hezekiah, today Manasseh, they were all meant to uphold justice, to uphold righteousness, to lead their people in proper true worship of Yahweh. They all failed, to various degrees. In Jesus, we have fulfillment of both. We have a fulfillment of Israel. He is the light of salvation to the nations. He is the righteous judge of the nations. And he is the fulfillment of the line of David, the King of Kings, the one true King. Jesus embodies the restorative work that God began immediately after the fall. He is the culmination of God's mercy, God's salvation plan. Not only did Jesus suffer at the highest level of pain and injustice, he lived a perfect life, and therefore was the perfect sacrifice needed to atone for all the sin and evil committed by humanity. As I was reading this week, I was really struck by what N.T. Wright wrote. As one old evangelistic tract put it, the nations of the world got together to pronounce judgment on God for all the evils in the world, only to realize with shock that God had already served his sentence. Jesus is our ultimate answer to evil. So when it comes to making sense of suffering and evil, we know that God is just, he cares deeply about evil, and he promises to judge it righteously in the end. And God is merciful. He loves the world, even the worst sinners, even you and I, even Manasseh. And because of the work of Jesus, we can find forgiveness when we depend on him. And finally, this passage teaches us that in the middle of evil, God is sovereign. He works destruction for good. I like how N.T. Wright puts it. Ever since the Garden of Eden, ever since God's grief over Noah, ever since Babel and Abraham, the story has been about the messy way in which God has had to work to bring the world out of the mess. God's sovereignty. We know he is ultimately working all things for the good of those who love him, as it says in Romans 8. He is constantly bringing order out of chaos, rest and renewal to weariness, and beauty out of destruction. Now, God does not cause evil. All that God creates is good, but he does redeem the consequences of evil for his own good purposes. He redeems the consequences of evil for his own good. And the cross is ultimately his promise to restore all things. I think if each of us looks back even over our own lives, we can see the suffering and the pain that we've experienced used by God and redeemed by God for our own sake and for others. In the case of Manasseh, we see God's sovereignty at work when two generations later, his grandson Josiah becomes one of the best kings in Judah's history. All because God, in his sovereign plan, allowed Manasseh to live and reign so long. Now let me ask you this. Is anyone too evil for God to redeem? Is anyone too far gone? It would certainly seem like Manasseh is. The answer is yes and no, thankfully. Many sinners in this world do die completely devoted to their sin. We see the story of Pharaoh in Exodus, whose heart was actually hardened to God. But the truth is that only God can see someone's heart